Hey friends, thanks so much for joining us. A very different broadcast to share with you this time, and I wanted to try something a little different, talk about a subject that I've never really spoken about too much before, although I have written about it not very long ago, and that's the topic of UFO disclosure. Now, typically we shy away from the subject of UFOs because it can be used against those in the truth movement, much like a turd in the punch bowl, meaning to infect the punch bowl of truth with a topic that can be perceived as so fringe can tend to take away from all of the other hardcore truths that we talk about regularly, including the criminal bankers, the central banks, the manipulation of our currencies, the New World Order's plans to enslave humanity through Agenda 21, and so many of the other things that we talk about regularly. But as a person concerned with truth and about the future of humanity, I do spend some time thinking about the UFO question and the question of hidden technologies that the military-industrial complex may have and that they're not sharing with humanity. I know Catherine Austin Fitts has often talked about a breakaway civilization, and I do think there's an argument to be made that there is a breakaway civilization right here on our planet that has technologies that they've harnessed for themselves and that they will not share with us. And as they move forward into a brave new future, it's my fear that they're going to leave us behind. As I've long said, at this point in human history, it's humanity versus the banksters. And I think at the very top of the pyramid, the banksters and their cohorts possess technologies that are going to allow them to travel to the stars without us. Now, why would I have this conversation? One of the reasons is we live in a galaxy teeming with life, in my opinion. How could it not be? There are billions of stars, and around every star is potentially many, many planets that could support life. After all, as Joe Rogan has said, if we as human beings can send a rover to Mars, then certainly advanced civilizations could send spacecraft to visit us. Now, in this interview, we're going to talk about many, many different topics, but I should probably introduce my guest. His name is Andrew Johnson. He runs the site checktheevidence.com. He's the author of the book 9/11 Finding the Truth. He's based in the UK, where he works as a tutor at the Open University, and he has a background in software engineering. I found out about Andrew through an interview I watched with him by 108 Morris, who runs a great YouTube channel. And without further ado, let me introduce you to Andrew Johnson. Andrew, welcome.
Hello, Sean. Thanks for inviting me onto your program.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you. Thanks for taking the time. And ironically, one of the channels we follow, We Are Change, Luke Rudkowski, has just done an interview with the Canadian former Minister of Defense, Paul Hellyer. Now, that's absolutely just a coincidence. I'd set this interview up with you a month ago. But apparently, Andrew, this topic is a topic of interest to others in the truth community as well, and I thought we should explore it. First of all, Andrew, before we really jump into this vast and enormous topic that really we could spend hours and hours talking about, why don't you tell us a little bit about your site, checktheevidence.com?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Paul Hellyer because I met him a couple of years ago. Maybe we'll talk about that. But yes, my site, checktheevidence.com, covers some of the topics that you've mentioned there in your introduction. And actually, it was started as a result of my interest in the UFO topic, which was essentially reawakened in 2003. We'll talk about that maybe in a couple of minutes. But my background, as you mentioned there, is in software engineering. And that started for me at the age of 16 when I got my first 8-bit computer called a ZX Spectrum, which was built in the UK. I taught myself how to program it. I wrote a couple of games in it. One was like a Pac-Man game, made a few quid out of doing that. And then I went to university, studied a degree in computer science and physics. And following that, I went to work for a company called General Electric Projects in the Midlands of England, and was there for a couple of years. And then I eventually moved to this area of the country in the late 1980s, and I've been here ever since. My software engineering work took me across to the US about 3 or 4 times, and Canada twice, South Korea once, and been across to Europe several times with bits and pieces of work over there. So, I have a background in dealing with technical information, looking at engineering problems, sort of software engineering problems and solving them and getting paid money to do that. So, I have an analytical mind. I like to break things down, find out where the problems are, find out where the inconsistencies are, because as with all engineering disciplines, if you're working in the field, at the coalface, as you might call it, that's what you're required to do. If you want to actually get happy customers, you need to help them solve their problems. And so I've I've tried to apply those skills to the study of the UFO topic and to the study of 9/11, the study of the health cover-ups, and the study of the energy cover-up. And what I found is, and hopefully we'll get into some of this as we go through this, that all these things are interconnected, they're interrelated, and there's actually one or two researchers which I can name who are basically, they're at first looks, you think they're actually trying to get the truth out, but actually they're what you would call gatekeepers. I'm sure you're familiar with that expression, and they do what's called a limited hangout. So they'll give you something which you didn't know. It's important. You can establish that that is true, but then there are other things which they won't tell you and they won't talk about, even when you've established that those things are true. And that's really been my bugbear. These people that are bringing forward some of these truths, I've been giving a closer look at them since about probably 2007, 2008, and looking at the what I call the second tier of the cover-up, essentially.
Well, we'll get into all of that hopefully on this call, and feel free to name names if you like. I think that one of the things I want to do, though, for the listening audience, because I value the folks that visit SGT Report, I value the community we've built, and I value everyone's input on these issues, please feel free to leave your comments below. But I just want to address a couple of things. I know right off the bat when this topic is brought up, there are certain people who already have a polarized view and have drawn some conclusions, and I want everybody to keep an open mind, because I know it's very easy to say the UFO topic is being used as a setup for the Project Bluebeam deception, or others will say UFOs are nothing more than a demonic deception. I think those are just a bit too easy. I think in, again, a universe with billions of galaxies, it's just too easy to have simple answers like the government is solely using this as a deception to enslave humanity and to pull off a big hoax in the future. So with that said, I just want to play a couple clips. It's great to hear that you spoke with Paul Hellyer and that you've met him, because that's one of the first people I wanted to quote here. There's 4 people I want to quote, because if folks are going to say it's Project Bluebeam or it's a demonic deception and that's it, I just think it's too easy, because Paul Hellyer, Canada's former Minister of Defense, said, and I quote, "UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead." And here's a soundbite from Paul from an interview he did with Project Camelot.
That there are extraterrestrials visiting Earth that they have for millennia, and that they're, will probably also say that they've been working with the United States government closely for a number of years, and that they have shared technology, and that they're still here, and that they have developed things that we should know about.
And that they have developed things that we should know about. Well, how interesting. Because, Andrew, I've quoted many times in the past the former head of Lockheed Skunkworks, Ben Rich, who said, and I quote, "We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do," end quote. So let's talk a little bit about Paul Hellyer. He is probably the most distinguished UFO truther out there, certainly in terms of his pedigree as the former Minister of Defense of Canada. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your meeting with Paul Hellyer?
Yes, well, he's certainly an interesting fellow and very outspoken, and obviously he's got a lot of experience. But there are some things which he hasn't spoken about, which kind of surprised me a bit. He talked quite a bit about the Roswell incident because he'd read Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. That he started to talk about that in 2006, and he was saying that he checked out some of the names, he spoke to some of his contacts, and they verified those names in the Corso book, and so that led Hellier to conclude that what Corso had written was essentially true, and so he seemed to move forward from there. But, for example, he doesn't talk about one of his fellow Canadians, Wilbert Smith, or I haven't heard him talk about Wilbert Smith. And he's somebody that a friend of mine, Grant Cameron, had been doing research into for 25 years. And I've got a whole 2-hour presentation about Wilbert Smith. And the things that he got up to, because he, for example, said that he was given pieces that had been shot off, these flying saucers. He said he'd been given those to analyse. He said to his son when he was dying, he died in 1962, at the age of 52 from cancer of the lower bowel, and he told his son that he'd seen bodies. He'd travelled to the States on government business because Wilbert Smith was very highly qualified. He was the superintendent of radio regulations for the Canadian government in the 1950s and early 60s. He said he'd seen bodies. He said that people in the US had told him that the UFO issue, the flying saucer issue, as it was called then, was classified higher than the H-bomb. We've got documents which show this. We've got copies of these documents which show this, which were declassified in 1979. My meeting with Paul Hellier was sort of quite brief because I was speaking at the Global Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference in 2012 in November, which was in the Netherlands in Europe. And I'd been invited to give a talk there about the energy cover-up and how that ties into 9/11. And Paul Hellier was there. I can't remember what he was talking about, but we essentially shared a taxi from his hotel to the conference venue. And I didn't speak a lot to him, but I was travelling with Dr. Judy Wood, my friend who's written the book called Where Did the Towers Go? And that you mentioned 108 Morris. He's also interviewed Dr. Judy Wood a couple of times, and those interviews are on his YouTube channel. And we were basically discussing a little bit about 9/11 in the taxi journey. Not a great deal, but he was fairly reticent. I don't know whether he didn't really know who I was, I don't think, and so I think he was perhaps being a little bit reserved in what he was saying. And I've watched and listened to him, and he is a very interesting chap to speak to. But I'm not entirely sure that he fully grasps the way that the cover-up is working. And you mentioned the breakaway civilization in your introduction, and I think that is correct. I think there is a breakaway civilization, and I think that Ben Rich's quote, for example, speaks to that idea very, very closely. And I think Ben Rich knew what was going on. Going back a few years to Eisenhower's speech, where he spoke to the nation in his final address to the nation in 1961, and many people are familiar with the military-industrial complex part of that speech. But I wanted to read an additional bit of that speech, which I think people are less familiar with, and I'll just read that now because it's only very short.
Sure.
In that speech, Eisenhower said, "The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded." And he said, "Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite." And in my way of thinking, you could interpret this phrase scientific, technological elite as a breakaway civilization. And that goes but right back to 1961. So I think that Eisenhower had seen what was going on. And if you look, for example, at the MJ-12 documents that Stanton Friedman has done a lot of research into, some UFO researchers just say, "Oh no, they're a hoax," just disregard them. But if you study what Stanton Friedman's put together about those documents, I think it's pretty watertight, and I think he has been able to show fairly clearly that in 1947 there was legislation which came into being, and President Truman, he formed the National Security Council, and I think as part and parcel of that, this group, which was given the name MJ12, was also formed, and people were invited into this group, and they helped to manage the information which was being disseminated following the Roswell crash in 1947. And again, look at the Roswell incident. That there is a huge amount of evidence and many witnesses which have come forward since Jesse Marcel came forward, I think, in 1978. And again, Stanton Friedman did some very good research into that incident. And I think the significance of that event cannot be really underestimated. And I think I'll also just mention that that happened in 1947, which of course was, and it happened at Roswell, which was where they had the bomber squadron, which did the bombings in Japan. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I really do not think that is a coincidence. There is something in that which shows that whatever this craft was, whatever beings were flying it, were looking at what was going on in that area. I think that becomes a fairly strong prospect when you look at all the evidence.
Well, that's interesting because when you talk about a scientific technological elite, it makes me think of Huxley's mention of a scientific technological dictatorship, Orwell's warnings to us, and we see it unfolding. We know of Google's relationship with the NSA. We know about DARPA. We know about all of the hidden assets within the Pentagon, the black projects which Ben Rich speaks about, the CIA, which of course now conveniently claims that all of those 1950s UFO sightings were us. I'm not buying it any more than I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and that the CIA wasn't involved in the assassination of our president. But without getting too far off base here, I want to just circle back and remind people that this is not a conversation happening just between myself and Andrew in the UK. This is a conversation happening at the highest levels. This is a conversation that's been happening among astronauts. And I just want to point out for people who are still very skeptical about having this conversation at all that astronaut Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man on the moon, says the UFO cover-ups must end. And Andrew, astronaut Gordon Cooper in 1951 has recounted his encounter with UFOs as he was flying jets. And this bizarre encounter in 1957 at Edwards Air Force Base, and this is in Gordon Cooper's own words. Let me play this for you.
As they were sitting there filming, a little saucer came from, I say little saucer, it was a saucer, came flying over their heads, put down 3 little landing gear and landed right out on the dry lake bed. And they picked up their cameras and started over toward it, filming as they went. And when they got in fairly close to it, it lifted up, put the gear back in the wheel wells, tipped up, and took off at a great rate of speed.
Andrew, I wanted to play that for you because I do appreciate your intellect and your research on these topics. You spoke at the 4th Annual British Exopolitics Expo, and your presentation was called The Taboo of Disclosure. And I just want to quote you briefly from that. You said, "The truth is very uncomfortable. If you make people think, they will like you, but if you make people really think, they will hate you." It's interesting how knowledge and research is covered up and used against us. 2.1 trillion went missing from the Pentagon, according to Donald Rumsfeld. He announced that on September 10th, and on September 11th, 2001, 9/11 happened, and it was never brought up again. Where are all of these trillions going? What would you like to talk about? Should we talk about this breakaway civilization? Should we talk about what you think some of the best evidence is for the breakaway civilization? Where would you like to go next?
Well, I think we can probably tie into some of what you've played there, for example, Gordon Cooper's clip, because, this guy was a Mercury astronaut, and I think he held one of the early records that he orbited the Earth, I think, 22 times. And that particular clip that you played, it was also that story Gordon Cooper also told in a video called Out of the Blue, which was made in 2003 by James Fox. And I recommend that people watch that. I'm pretty sure the whole thing is on YouTube, and you can track it down. It's a very good video to watch. And Cooper, I think, was basically an honest guy. and he was uncompromising. And he, as I understand it, was going to be selected for the Apollo program, but then was later dropped. And I think the reason he was dropped is because he was too honest.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to Edgar Mitchell, yes, indeed, Edgar Mitchell has spoken out about the ET cover-up. But then again, if you investigate Edgar Mitchell rather more deeply, you will come up against some rather difficult issues. For example, when he was interviewed, it was sort of kind of an ambush interview that Bart Sabrell did, I think around about year 2000, 2001, where Sabrell actually quizzed Mitchell over the authenticity of the moon landings, and he went to Mitchell's house and started to bring this up with him, and he showed him a piece of film which Sabrell had been given from the NASA archives, which Sabrell had said proves that the moon, the Apollo 11 flight was hoaxed, and Mitchell became very, very uncomfortable, and at first he was sort of somewhat civil, but at the end he kicked out Bart Sabrell from his house. He literally kicked him, almost literally kicked him up the backside. And Mitchell had a radio mic on him, and this was left running as Sabrell was leaving the house, and said, "Look, if you want to take me to court, I'll look forward to it." And Mitchell's son is heard to hear in this recording. Shall we call the CIA and have him waxed? And he says something like, "Shall we shoot him?" And you can hear these words clearly on the audio. You later find out about Mitchell, for example, that he was involved with bringing over Uri Geller from Israel to do tests in the USA. And you later hear from Bruce De Palma, who was the inventor of the End machine, which was basically some type of free energy device, which De Palma developed, I think, in the 1980s. Mitchell went to see Bruce De Palma in California, and Bruce De Palma says, and this clip is on YouTube, "I was visited by Edgar Mitchell, who said to me, if you're going to go around doing this kind of thing in California, you're going to get your head blown off." That's what Mitchell said to him. And Mitchell apparently made an offer to buy out Bruce De Palma from the rights to this end machine, or the design for it. You then will also hear Mitchell's response to David Sereda, and I think we should mention David Sereda because when we were discussing this chat in the email, we talked about the Tether incident.
Absolutely, STS-75, the NASA Space Shuttle Tether incident, and I am a fan of Sereda's, and I've watched his dissection of that incident countless times because I find him very, very fascinating. So let's get into that. But before we get to that, let's circle back. I want to say a thing about Mr. Mitchell and the moon missions. But go ahead.
Yeah, so we'll do that in a second. But so David Sereda wrote to Edgar Mitchell and asked him about artifacts in the Tether footage. And basically, David Sereda read out Mitchell's response on the video. And Mitchell said he couldn't see anything unusual in the video, and you kind of just, your jaw is dropping because this video is clearly anomalous. There's clearly things there which there is no explanation for, and Sereda goes at great pains to explain it all, and he does a very good job, and yet Mitchell cannot see this. So this is what goes back to my opening comments about these gatekeepers. Mitchell is clearly disclosing certain information, whilst to me, as I see it, and I will argue with anyone over this if they want to write to me or speak to me, I'll show them the clips that I've collected of Mitchell over the years. The guy is clearly singing from different hymn books. He's singing different tunes, and he admits in this clip about Uri Geller, which was broadcast in 2013, he admits he was working for the CIA. He actually admits that. So people need to be aware of these things. And as Bruce De Palma said, Mitchell founded this group called IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He founded that, I think, in the mid-80s or the early 90s. I can't remember the exact date. And Bruce De Palma said, what's more comforting than a group which is founded on transcendental principles and bringing free energy to the world. That sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what the CIA do. They'll found these front groups to attract people in and watch what they're doing, basically, and keep an eye on things, because they're protecting vested interests. And Mitchell, it is now clear to me, at least, if to nobody else, Mitchell is now part of that management operation.
Yeah, I want to just address the moon landings to the degree that if anybody has given serious thought to whether or not we were able to achieve what we were told was achieved by putting men on the moon, just a couple of things I want to address. If you take a look at the news conference with Neil Armstrong and the other astronauts after their heralded return from the moon, they're the most depressed, sad men having accomplished something so extraordinary that I've ever seen in any press conference ever. And take a look at that. But perhaps more on the point, Andrew, and I'm sure you know of this, in 2009 it was reported that after an exhaustive 3-year search for some tapes that contained the original footage of the Apollo 11 moonwalk, we're told by NASA that they're gone. They're missing. They can't be found. Perhaps they were erased. But some 700 tapes of the original footage of the men on the moon, most of which was never broadcast, are gone. And along with that is all of the data, the telemetry data, all of the data that would ever be able to be researched by anybody that would want to see how they made the oxygen, for instance, last on such a long trip. How did they have enough fuel to make the trip? All of that data is gone too. So there is no quantifiable data to be able to really go back and dissect to prove that what NASA claims happened. And I find that a little curious, don't you?
I do, and I've done a whole 2-hour presentation about the Apollo missions and the claims made. And I think, without going into all those details, and you've made some absolutely valid points there. Of course, you don't really, almost don't even need to look at any of that. Just think about the U.S. manned space program. I mean, there isn't one now. There isn't a U.S. manned space program, and yet, George Bush in 2004, on the 100th anniversary of powered flight, announced the renewal of the Moon to Mars program, and you had all these plans laid out, and the people did feasibility studies and so forth. And then in 2010, Obama announces that they weren't going to go back to the moon. And Obama does this speech. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. But the original projection from Bush was that they were going to be back on the moon, I think, in 2020. And this was announced in 2004. So that was going to take them 16 years from 2004 to go back to the moon. Yet, going back to 1961, Kennedy made his speech, and allegedly the first landing was made in 69. So by my maths, that's 8 years. And one has to factor in that since the 1970s, we've had vast advances in computer technology, significant advances in materials sciences, with new sort of composite materials and carbon nanotubes and all these exotic materials that we never had then. Yet it's still taking them, according to Bush's projection, or the people that did those feasibility studies, twice as long to get back to the moon.
Yeah.
Something they've already allegedly done.
Yeah.
How does this add up? How can this possibly add up?
Well, it adds up in this way. It adds up that the public-facing space program is a joke, and
Yes.
Ben Rich was right. Quote, "We already have the means to travel among the stars. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do," end quote. Lockheed Skunkworks former head Ben Rich. Now, again, we talk about black projects. We talk about a breakaway civilization. There's no better example of it than that. And the fact of the matter is, and I think anybody who wants to take a look at the Apollo missions and the claims about the moon landings and really give it some critical thought can easily conclude that not only were the Russians leaps and bounds ahead of us in terms of their accomplishments in space in the 60s, in the late 50s and early 60s, we were in a Cold War, we were told, with the Russians. The powers that be, the CIA and this government, needed to take a stand publicly to at least rally the American people around the idea that we were as technologically advanced and as capable as the Russians, and in this Cold War we were going to beat them to the moon. Now, did we really get to the moon? I don't know. It seems to me that based on the fact that NASA has lost all of the evidence of the visit to the moon and all of the data that can prove it, I have a big question mark about whether or not that really happened. But you mentioned the STS-75 Tether incident, and I emailed you about that because I think that is one of the most extraordinary pieces of footage I've ever seen. And for those who aren't familiar with it, I just want you to understand that there was a mission, STS-75, to launch a tethered satellite system, and as the tether was being unrolled and unraveled as the satellite was moving out away from the space shuttle, the tether snapped and the satellite continued off into the distance, 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles. And the video cameras are focused on this, and the resulting activity behind the satellite, I want to point out, the resulting activity that was captured on video is absolutely jaw-dropping.
Yeah, I mean it is. It's a very unusual piece of film because, you have to sort of stop, because one of the claims that's made about UFOs generally, there's no clear footage and, it's all hoaxes, or, the people that film it are idiots and they don't know what they're looking at. But of course, there are a number of those factors which are immediately ruled out when you look at the source of this film. It's from NASA, it's from the shuttle, it's being filmed by astronauts. These are supposed to be, the NASA is supposed to be an organization with, knowledge of space. The astronauts are supposed to be individuals with knowledge of what's in space and things that they should see and things that they probably wouldn't see. So you've got to initially take all those factors into account. Then you have to look at the video and try and explain what's going on. Now, NASA will simply come back with the explanation that what you're seeing is ice crystals, But in this video, you've got ice crystals which are different shapes. They're pulsating. They're going in different directions. You've got these discoid pulsating craft. Seen it from sort of seen in unusual ways. And you've got this unexpected thing with the incident where when they set this tether, where I think it was on a cable which I think was 12 miles long or something. It was very, very long. They actually ended up getting some kind of discharge, and I think they weren't expecting this discharge. And some have said that this proves that there is this, energy source which we can tap into in space like that. And because this charge apparently blew out part of the connection, and that's why the cable broke, and they weren't able to complete the experiment which they were trying to do. So again, go and watch the footage, look at it on YouTube, look at it for yourself, listen to the commentary, listen to what NASA is saying, and see what you think of it. To me, it clearly shows that NASA are doing an experiment in space with a satellite. It goes wrong, and there are other things, in the picture which are taking an interest in that experiment.
Yeah, that's right.
These are intelligently controlled craft, in other words.
Yeah, and I agree with you. They're objects that are clearly moving. They're not stars. And for NASA to say that they're ice crystals is preposterous, because if we know that the tether has moved a certain number of miles away from the shuttle, and we see these objects clearly pass, in some cases, behind the tether, we can get a sense of the size of these objects to some degree, number one. And number two, we know that they can't be ice crystals, because you would never, ever be able to pick up and see those ice crystals at that distance, and they certainly wouldn't be larger than the tether. So I think NASA has a long history of not divulging the truth to the people, and the STS-75 video is clearly more evidence of that. You mentioned David Sarita. Why don't you tell people a little bit about David Sarita? And I've always been fascinated by him, and his examination of this specific incident is on YouTube. I like him. I haven't heard much from him recently. Is he still active in this area?
I'm not actually sure about what he's doing recently. I'll tell you what I know about him. I think he had a UFO sighting when he was in his early teens, sometime like that, and so he became very interested. He did that video with Dan Aykroyd, the chap who was in Ghostbusters, the movie. They made, I think Dan Aykroyd introduced the NASA UFO evidence, or evidence, the case for NASA UFOs, which was about 4 or 5 hour video that Sarita made in 1999, which is where he makes some of those points you just made about the disc going behind the tether, and you can clearly see that. David Sereda also made another video. Oh crikey, was it called? I can't remember what the name of it was. It might have been called Interstellar. Now I know there's been a movie which has just come out with that name in the last few months, and I think. But David Sereda did an interesting video which featured Boyd Bushman, who was one of the Lockheed Martin researchers, who was a senior scientist at Lockheed Martin, and Sereda went and interviewed him and was told some very unusual things about what Bushman was researching into, and Sereda also tries to work out what the mechanism for the propulsion might be of these flying discs, the flying saucers or the craft, or whatever you want to call them. He also does that in the case for NASA UFOs, evidence case for NASA UFOs, and of course it's very speculative. He's only deriving what he concludes from the videos, and he hasn't had access to a crashed disk or anything like that, obviously. But it is nevertheless an interesting video, and I think also moving on from there. I have actually spoken to somebody, and I've done a series of interviews with somebody who spent a period of time working in Area 51 in 1979. And, we could talk about that if you like, because that again ties in with this, secret technology and the possible breakaway civilization and so forth.
Oh, absolutely. Let's do that. You mentioned the examination and the speculation about what type of propulsion systems, what type of technology would allow for these craft to travel, how they do interstellar, how does that happen, how is it even possible? I wrote a piece earlier in the year here called Government Approved Disclosure on History Channel. Let me read just a little bit of this for you, Andrew. The History Channel's Hangar 1, the UFO files, gets a lot of facts right. In fact, it has the ring of government-mandated disclosure. Let me jump down. What inspired me to write about this at all is a portion of the episode that presented a piece of information that I had never heard before. Many of us know about Bob Lazar and his incredible claims. You can research some of them on the Wikipedia page for Bob Lazar here. Lazar claimed, among other things, to have worked for the U.S. government as a physicist in a place called S4, allegedly located at Papoose Lake, southwest of top-secret Area 51 near Groom Dry Lake, Nevada. Lazar claimed that he had specifically worked on reverse engineering extraterrestrial spacecraft and alien technology. I know everybody knows that, but here's the part I didn't know. In a 1989 press conference, Lazar also made the claim that a new unknown element was given to humans by aliens. He said it was known as element 115, ununpentium. Lazar claimed that ununpentium provided for a nearly 100% efficient source of energy which allowed for space travel beyond the realm of the laws of existing physics. Now, this was all covered in this documentary on History Channel, so let me continue here. Lazar was largely dismissed by the establishment media as delusional or a nut or both. But flash forward to the year 2004. The episode Hangar 1, the UFO Files, Alien Technology reminds us of Lazar's claim about ununpentium and then points out that in 2004, chemists at Lund University, here's the part I never knew, in Sweden announced their discovery of, wait for it, element 115, ununpentium. I never knew that. I never knew that 15 years after Lazar's incredible claims, ununpentium was discovered and added to the periodic table of elements as element 115. In doing some basic research for the article, I stumbled upon a current interview with Bob Lazar in which Bob talks with George Knapp about the recent discovery of element 115. I just think it's crazy. How would one predict that? It's as bizarre and unlikely, Andrew, as the BBC reporting about the collapse of WTC-7 30 minutes prior to the building collapsing. It seems to add a lot of credibility to Bob Lazar's claims. What do you make of any of this?
Well, I think that, to be honest, that's what it was designed to do. It was designed to enable the Lazar story to be propped up later on, because this is the way that really good disinformation, high-quality disinformation works. Now, I became intrigued by the Bob Lazar case too, and it wasn't Bob Lazar that I spoke to as regards the work in Area 51. Now, without going into all the details, my conclusion about the Lazar case is that I think his basic story is true. In other words, there is technology which has been reverse engineered and people have been invited to work on that technology, people that you perhaps might not expect. And it's possible even that Lazar was one of those people. And it seems like he was, if you listen to his story about the power unit of this craft and how it worked and how it was able to kind of create a gravity field in a certain way which would propel the craft in different modes of motion. And he goes into quite a lot of detail about that, and it sounds like he knows what he's talking about. However, we then get to the Element 115 story, which if you read it, essentially, I don't think he says this explicitly, but if you listen to what he says, it's implied that the Element 115 is the fuel, or at least forms part of the fuel for this craft. And I think this is where the disinformation crops in, because I don't think these craft are fueled with anything like that. I think they extract energy from the vacuum, as you might call it. They don't have a fuel source, therefore you don't need some exotic process to produce fuel, such as these exotic processes by which they manufacture Element 115. Now, did Bob Lazar know that? Not necessarily, because I heard a discussion with Bob Lazar on Coast to Coast. I've got this, I think, on my website somewhere. Now, the people might not know that there were three guys who were primarily involved with the Bob Lazar case. There was John Lear, who I've spoken to, not specifically about the Lazar case, but I have spoken to John Lear on a couple of radio programs that we did with somebody else hosting the interview. There was another guy called Gene Huff, who actually sold real estate, and then, of course, was Bob Lazar. And they basically, I can't remember how they originally got in touch, but they used to go out to, the sort of Nevada hills, and Bob Lazar said, if you go on a Wednesday night, at sort of between midnight and 1 a.m., you'll see these craft because that's when they test them. So John Lear went out with his telescope, and he was able to view these craft flying around, according to him. I think he even got a video of one, but it wasn't particularly clear because it was way off in the distance, probably 2 or 3 miles away. So it appears that Bob Lazar did indeed have access to real, verifiable information from inside the base. But does that necessarily mean that everything he said about the project he worked on is true? And I don't think it does. Now, going to the person that I've talked to, who's called Edgar Fouché, and he has documents which are online. He's shown me these documents and they're available online. They prove that he worked in Area 51 in 1979. Okay, he was on specialist temporary duty there, as he called it, TDY, temporary duty, and he was fixing some cryptographics equipment. And he's basically pointed out that he was taken on this bus with blacked out windows. When he got to the site, he had to put goggles on so that he could only see like 20 feet in front of him so that he could walk, and beyond that and around him he couldn't see anything because he didn't have full clearance to be at the base. And you can listen to his whole story. I've done, I think, 5.5 hours of interviews with him, and it's all on my YouTube channel, and it's all on my website. He also did a presentation at the International UFO Congress in 1998, about an hour and about 90-minute presentation. That's all online, and you can watch that. And he actually ended up putting out false information accidentally because he was basing his one of his conclusions that he was actually at or near the S4 base. I can't remember exactly what he said about it, but he eventually worked out that what Bob Lazar said couldn't be true because the S4 base wasn't where Lazar said it was. I think Ed Fouché eventually worked out that it was S4 was in the Tonopah test range, and it wasn't where Lazar said it was. And Lazar also didn't. All Lazar produced was a pass, which Ed Fouché says was faked. And also there was an interview with Bob Lazar from 1994, which was filmed at the Little Alien, or a presentation, not an interview, where Lazar was asked about his college professors and what they taught him and what their names were, and he couldn't remember their names. And I mean, I can remember the names of my college professors, from when I was there, and he couldn't remember them, which is very odd. Or he gave names which they couldn't verify were actually at the college at that time, you know.
Well, in his
So-
in his defense, Andrew, I'm terrible with names, and I can name my favorite couple of professors from college, but I can't name
Right.
all of them. I sure
Right.
as heck can't name all of them.
Sure. I understand what you're saying, and I'm not saying that Bob Lazar is, as I said, I don't think his story is a total fabrication, but I think disinformation has been injected into his story deliberately, because those that are in the know can then discredit him. I mean, Stanton Friedman, for example, who I've referred to a number of times, he doesn't believe Lazar's story, or not all of it anyway,
Sure.
and he's pointed out some of these fallacies. So not everyone accepts it, and I think, you know, it's safe for them to disclose this element 115, or apparently disclose it, because again, it's a fuel source, you see. And one of the things they don't want people to realise is that we don't need fuel sources of any kind. If we have the right technology, we can run these things with essentially without any fuel. The energy can be extracted from, you know, the quantum foam, or the 0 point field, or whatever you want to call it. And you know, maybe we'll get into this, maybe we won't have time, but I think that was demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt on 9/11.
Hey friends, if you're still with us, you're going to want to stick with us for part 2. Andrew took a right turn to talk about 9/11. Where did the buildings go? In the work of Dr. Judy Wood, not all of which I agree with, which makes for a very informative conversation. So stay tuned for part 2. It's coming soon. And thanks for watching. Be sure to visit us at sgtreport.com for all the latest 24/7.